All right, so I will kick things off quickly and just say, if you heard our bios already, Stacey and I are attorneys at Beveridge Diamond, which is a law firm that specializes in environmental law. We do a lot of work with products and packaging and regulatory counseling and enforcement. So we're really excited to be here today. So thank you, Jen and EcoWell for inviting us here. Next slide, please, and I'll just go through the agenda. So I saw a little bit of the discussion earlier in the program, and there's been some amazing presenters and a lot of great information on green marketing, and I saw some things about plastic packaging. Again, since we're lawyers, we are going to approach all these issues that you have been talking about and that everyone's so excited about. We're going to be approaching them from the legal framework. So we're going to talk about the product life cycle and an overview of a product life cycle beginning to end, and some of the legal issues to think about, and then talk about climate and ESG reporting. Stacey is an expert in that, and so it'll be exciting to hear from her on that. And then a little bit on the types of plastic packaging legislation that has been coming out around the country. We'll talk about the legal framework for green marketing. I know there's been a lot of discussion about how to substantiate claims. We'll talk about the legal framework and also some new legislation around the definitions of recycling and recycled packaging. And then we'll talk about a concept, if you haven't heard it before, about extended producer responsibility, is sort of like what to do with products at the end of their life. So Stacey, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Allyn, and hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. And thanks again to Jen for inviting us to join. It's a really awesome platform and project, and we're really excited to be here. So I will just kick us off on the substantive level with, there we go. We figured, because this is a really diverse audience and group with a lot of different disciplines, that this was a helpful way to level set, just to think about all of the variety of environmental compliance issues that arise and sustainability issues that arise across the beauty and personal care products life cycle. Allyn and I'll dive a little deeper into a couple of these issues, as Allyn said through the agenda, but we just wanted to give this kind of high level, sort of some of these cross-cutting issues, some of these more specific issues that we hope you'll think of as you go through your work when you're thinking about compliance issues, and from the lawyer's point of view. So a good example, well, I'll mention for each of these columns, something that's important to keep in mind is that they don't just apply to your products, they also apply to your packaging, to your manufacturing facilities, to your suppliers' operations, to brick and mortar stores, and as Allyn will get into with the green marketing issues, and that you've heard already today, into your written materials, into your copy, into your websites and advertising materials. So it's really important to think about these issues very broadly. A good example is thinking about plastics. So big issue. I'm sure you've heard the word plastics about 400 times today, at least. We certainly do in our work, but you think about manufacturing and issues like microbeads and microplastics, where microbeads are a big issue for exfoliants, and if they're used in particular types of personal care products, those can end up in wastewater. And we're seeing emerging regulations on drinking water and wastewater that look to the ideas of how do we regulate microplastics. So that will have down the line or upstream implications for all of you in your work if you have any kind of materials that involve microplastics or microbeads. We've also got import restrictions on used plastic. Huge push now to use recycled plastic, from recycled drinking water bottles to recycled fish nets, all kinds of things. The feedstock is usually brought in from other locations outside of our country. The classification of those used products as waste can have really significant implications for getting those products around, used materials around, because they're classified as waste and are restricted in certain ways. So that's something to think about in terms of the sort of manufacturing and importing bucket. Then in the product compliance bucket, think about, your packaging as well in that space, not just your products, but also your packaging. we're seeing a ton of restrictions on single-use plastics. And as Allyn will talk about, recycled content mandates for plastic packaging. That's something you need to know about in the front end so that your supply chain is all mapped out to make sure that you're meeting those requirements along the line. And then this end of life bucket is huge. I spend a lot of time on this with our electronics clients, but it applies very much to your sector. And just, the EPR requirements for packaging, we'll talk about that extended producer responsibility trend, but also just basic disposal of materials that are classified as hazardous waste that you wouldn't think about. I mean, as a kid, I definitely didn't think my nail polish was hazardous waste, but it absolutely is classified by EPA under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. You can't dispose of it in certain ways. It's treated as hazardous waste. That applies for things like hairspray, suntan lotion, hair removal cream, shampoo, so very innocuous seeming materials can have really big implications on your operations and your responsibility to dispose of them in certain ways. And then we have this big bucket along the bottom, the climate change disclosures and ESG. Those cross-cutting issues, we're seeing a lot of activity there right now where, sort of nice to have voluntary reporting about your supply chain implications for climate. Now they're becoming mandatory, not just globally, but increasingly domestically. So that's something that I'll just chat about in a sec to give you some ideas of how broad that trend is and ways that you can think about it depending on the size of your operation. And with that little reminder at the bottom there, just from a legal perspective, the more products you have, the more jurisdictions you operate in, and that's going to be the more regulations that you're subject to. So these can kind of balloon out depending on how the size and scope and location of your operations. So with this climate and ESG reporting trends thing, I spend so much of my time on this, and it's dizzying to see how much is changing on an everyday basis. But we're just seeing a really big trend towards transparency, this mandatory transparency, including, I put scope 3 emissions up there. For the uninitiated, that essentially means mapping out and disclosing the climate footprint, your emissions greenhouse gas footprint across your supply chain. So not just your operations, not just the electricity that you use, but also all of that for your suppliers from the very beginning of your supply chain. So that's a pretty significant lift for a lot of operations to try and figure out how do we get our suppliers to tell us what our footprint is. And there are companies on the huge scale down to the smaller scale trying to figure out how do we put this into practice and how do we get transparency on that level. The SEC regulations governing mandatory climate disclosure, those are regulations we're expected to see in the next couple, supposed to hear about it tomorrow, next week. So it should be any day now, hopefully, but this is something that we should expect in the next couple of months to come out, requiring climate disclosure, probably scope 3. So maybe, we don't know, but that could be something that would be a very significant lift for publicly traded companies. We're also seeing a lot of trends at the state level in this respect, California being predictably a key jurisdiction in that respect. The Climate Corporate Accountability Act, SB 260, has a lot of momentum right now. It applies to companies with over $1 billion in annual revenue. So it is limited scope for larger companies, but but the implications are pretty significant with respect to disclosures. It's going to require those large companies to report their emissions to the state beginning in 2025. And those emissions must be verified by a third party. So that's a big lift for companies that are not already doing that. The California Transparency and Supply Chains Act also is worth noting. That's already in place, and that requires disclosure of efforts to eradicate human trafficking and slavery in supply chains. So that's something that highlights not just the climate pressure for transparency, but also issues involving human rights and worker rights as well. So those are two big trends that we're seeing. We're also seeing significant new bills targeting the fashion industry, which is adjacent but still relevant, I think, in New York and Washington. And those bills are hefty and sprawling and require mapping of 50% of your supply chain, scope 3 emissions reporting, just really, really broad reporting and transparency requirements that are enforceable in really meaningful ways with pretty significant penalties. So this is that trend of, the nice to have. Oh, it's great that you have a sustainability report. It's great that you're talking about your emissions. Now it's becoming something with enforceable significant penalties. So just really something to keep in mind. It's not just in Europe anymore. It's not just a global thing. It's also coming home to the States. This is all added to what we're seeing as a building investor, NGO, and customer pressure trend. We have a lot of clients in the energy sector. That's yielding crazy trends with activist investors who are switching up seats on boards and requiring change where they're not seeing it voluntarily. Or you're seeing investor proxy questions, that sort of thing. So you're seeing pressure where companies are not voluntarily shifting and providing more transparency from investors and from customers demanding it. So again, this is a big space where we're seeing some trends in the compliance end, and just wanted to make sure we shared it and you were all aware. I will pass it back to Allyn. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's still me. I will quickly run through this. We just wanted to also share some of the plastic packaging compliance considerations, because this is a really big and growing area. First, just bans on single-use plastic. You've probably seen this all over the place with respect to plastic bags, and it's really commonplace with things like with eating plastic utensils and that sort of thing. We have those bans in California, Connecticut, New York, Maine, Oregon, Vermont. So this is an already fast-moving space, but depending on the definition of what single-use plastic is, that can have implications for what for the packaging that you're using. You should have it in mind for the jurisdictions that you operate in and sell, or you sell. Eco design and recycled content mandates for plastic packaging. Allyn is going to speak to this in more detail, but we're seeing more pressure to incorporate recycled material in plastic packaging. And a lot of that is going to front load thinking about these materials in your design phase. So it's something to know about, particularly if you have key jurisdictions, if they have these requirements. Are you thinking about, recycled content? Is there an eco design drive in some, or are they considering a bill in your state regarding eco design? That's a big trend, particularly in Europe, that we're seeing move over to the States. Import of recycled material and global feedstock. I mentioned this in the overview of the Lifecycle. I mean, we're seeing that there's not enough domestically pre and post consumer use plastic to meet the demand for all of this, not just these recycled content mandates, but, consumer interest in having recycled PET in the packaging for your beauty products. I remember I talked to Allyn about this. We love the packaging in our products. We realized that, it was really great to bring out that beautiful palette or really cool shampoo container, but now we're starting to see there's more interest in having these recycled materials, but it's really hard to move those materials. There are very different definitions characterizing used plastic as waste in different countries. So it's hard to move it from place to place, depending on where you're trying to move it and what the definitions of waste are. Breaking news is that there's a pending treaty on plastic management and disposal. We saw from the UN Environment Assembly over the last week. It's expected to go into force in 2024, with really big implications for moving plastic around. The details are still very much in play and still, being mapped out. But the commitment to have this international agreement is very big news and will have enormous implications down the supply chain for plastic packaging, for sourcing recycled plastic, and for being able to move used products like that around. And then finally, microplastics. We just saw California release its statewide strategy on microplastics, which is the first such plan strategy in the country. California already had a definition of microplastics in drinking water, and we see a bill in the California Assembly now, AB 2787, that aims to ban sale or distribution of products with intentionally added microplastics. But this strategy is actually in play now. The bill is pending and is very broad and very significant, but the strategy is what I think we should look at today, because it's actually in place. But it's something you just to think about in terms of if your products involve microplastics or microbeads, this could have some really enormous implications, especially if we see that trend across the country in other jurisdictions. With that, I will actually pass it to Allyn. The content mandates.
Yeah, so just building on the discussion of packaging, there are several different pieces of legislation focused on recycling, defining recycling, and actually having specific requirements for what it means to have recycled content in products, and packaging. So what are these, what is a recycled content mandate? Well, states in particular right now, at least, are passing legislation that sets these minimum standards for recycled content. So certain products and packaging have to have this specific amount of recycled material. A growing number of states are doing this with respect to bottles, but many also include a more broader category of plastic containers, and some states in particular specify household and personal care products are included. So the idea here is trying to drive change, improve recycled content, increase the recycled content in various products, and make those packages and products easier to recycle, because there is a big issue with recycling. A few years ago, China decided they were no longer going to just take all of our plastics and other goods from recycling, and that created a real problem in the US market. Municipalities are struggling to actually recycle all of the material that we think is recyclable, right? We put it in the curbside, not all of it is actually getting recycled. So a lot of this is an effort to improve the ability to recycle different products and packaging, but it will also, well, it can also, I should say, impact the cost of packaging. So it could be that it could increase the cost of packaging. This legislation makes the mandate requirements, regardless of cost. They don't really consider what the increase in cost is going to be. And next slide shows a couple examples of some of the states that have recycled content mandates. So you can see here, for example, in Washington, they specifically include personal care products, and it kind of gives you a sense, it's pretty typical, that they'll allow these regulations to build over time to give people a chance to get adjusted to them, and for the market to create new products, where you have a 10% mandate when the initial deadlines kick in, leading up to something like a 50% mandate, which would be pretty substantial. So I also include California. They proposed legislation, but it did not pass, although I think we could see it, that it definitely would be coming around again. So next slide, please. I'm going to quickly, and you can go to the next slide. I'm going to quickly talk about green marketing, which I know has been a topic of discussion this morning already in a couple presentations. So the Federal Trade Commission is the federal agency that is responsible for enforcing advertising claims. And they have something called the Green Guides. If you're not familiar with that, they're very good to review, because they give a lot of really good guidance and some specific guidance on how to make claims, what you should watch for, and how to substantiate claims, although the guidance is not as robust as it could be on what you need to do to substantiate a claim. But it is very clear that, like, if that's the only takeaway message you get about green marketing, that's it. Your claims have to be tailored to mean what they say, and the substantiation has to be behind them, and hold on to that documentation in case you get questions about that, either from an agency like the FTC or consumers or other people that are interested. The Green Guides are going to be updated this year. We know that for sure. We just don't know when. At least there'll be a proposal in place this year. And I'll talk at the end about some of the areas that we think, we might expect to see some changes. But if you're not familiar with the regulatory process, the FTC will propose updates to the Green Guides, and then that opens up a public comment period, which is really important, because that public comment period allows all of us to make comments on the proposal, on the rules, to submit information that the FTC should consider, and that's a really useful period of time, at least, to make your voice heard. So next slide, please. A couple of the claims to watch out for are, I'll focus really right now on this general environmental benefits, because vague terms like sustainability or sustainably sourced or eco-friendly, those are just, you can make them, but if you make them, you have to make sure that they're substantiated. And substantiating a generic claim like sustainable, when no one even knows how to define sustainable, I think is a really risky place to be. So no claim is prohibited, but you have to be really careful when you make these general environmental benefits. And I always recommend to just stay away from that, because it can really get you into a lot of trouble. And substantiating your claims also applies to environmental graphics. I'll talk later about the chasing arrow symbol, but any symbol that makes it look like it's an environmental claim will be imputed to have, an environmental meaning. And if you're not explaining exactly what it means, why you put that graphic on your product, that could get you into some hot water. So next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics. So recycling, obviously there is a lot in the Green Guides about recycling. The claim is focused on the ability to actually recycle. And I should have mentioned this earlier, FTC focuses its evaluation of whether or not a claim is lawful or not on consumer perception. So think about your market and think about the people that will be reading your marketing material or your packaging. What are they, what common sense would they take away? What common sense reading or interpretation would they take away from the information you're putting on your packaging? And so that's why you have to stay away from like really fine print or unclear terms, because it's really focused on what consumers would understand. So this claim, recyclable, is important because if something is recyclable, you have to know that it can be recycled in at least 60% of communities where it's sold. And so there's this, as I was saying before, municipalities are struggling to recycle all kinds of plastic. Whether you can say something is recyclable it's more and more important to understand whether or not you actually really can recycle it, or you shouldn't say that you can. Degradable and compostable. For degradable, you need proof that the product will completely degrade within a year. So you can't include any products that would go to recycling or a landfill. And compostable, consumers should be able to compost on their own. So either, in their own backyard or in their own pickup, curbside pickup, and not have to send it to some sort of special commercial compostable facility. Again, is because you're focused on what the consumer would understand. And if it's compostable only in kind of a specialized location, then that you can't make that claim. When it comes to terms like non-toxic, that has to be non-toxic for humans and the environment, and that requires scientific substantiation. So have that documentation ready and keep that available. And then free of claims are deceptive if they contain another substance that poses the same risk. So if you say that a product is free of one substance, if there's another chemical in there that poses a very similar risk, then you can't say it's free of the first one, even if it is. There's a lot to talk about here, but I know we don't have that much time, so I think I'll just leave it at that. Next slide, please. One thing I did want to mention about certifications or seals of approval, because there's a lot of different certifications that people can get, and that is a good way. Going to a third-party certifier is a good way of identifying your product as green. But you do have to make sure exactly what that certifier is doing, and make sure that your label really explains what it is certified for. So you can see in the green, on the green side, the good example shows that this label would be certified for biodegradable, recyclable, compostable. On the red side, it doesn't say anything. So it can be deceptive because it doesn't really explain what this certification is. And you can't presume that consumers understand what certifications mean. Next slide, please. So here's just a few recommendations. The narrower you can make your claim, the better. FTC calls that a qualified claim, but that means that, the more specific and clear you can make your claim, the easier it is for you to substantiate it, and the less likely there will be confusion from consumers or anyone else that your product isn't what it says it is. So review claims really carefully, and maybe even have someone else read them, someone else who isn't so familiar with the product, and see what they would say. That's kind of a nice way of backing up whether or not you could really, it's really understandable. Focus on meaningful benefits and not those that have marginal impact. If you're trying to really enhance a sustainability claim, or some kind of recyclability claim, let's say, you're trying to really enhance that and you want to emphasize that, but you're overlooking some serious problems with your product, or serious environmental impacts elsewhere, that also can be a false claim. So if you're kind of hyping up a marginal environmental benefit, but not also explaining some of the environmental impacts, then that can be problematic too. As I mentioned, the Green Guides are going to be updated in 2022. They may tackle the concept of sustainability just because there's been so many questions about it. We'll see. They might also update like organic or natural, which are terms that they didn't really address in the last update very much. And so maybe they will do that. They certainly, with the emphasis on plastics, we expect them to continue to talk about recyclable and reusable, and perhaps put some additional conditions there. So watch for that coming in the next several months. And then the last thing I want to talk about, next slide, Stacey, is that states are also really interested in marketing and green claims made in their state. So California in particular recently passed SB 343, which is basically California's own green marketing law that is more strict than the FTC, because in addition to the 60% requirement, material has to have a demonstrated recycling rate of at least 75%. So that is going to be tougher to do. And so stamping recycling or making a product recyclable in California needs a lot more backup information. All right, Stacey, I'll turn it back to you to talk about EPR.
I will close this out. Thank you, Ellen. I know we want to take the questions, but I'll just quickly cover this EPR section. So the bottom line is extended producer responsibility. Essentially, the concept is applying requirements to hold producers accountable for the end of life sort of recycling, waste management of their products, or the packaging of their products. We see it a lot with electronics, and now we're seeing it increasingly with plastic packaging. So this year, last year, 2021 was a big year for EPR laws, because we saw new bills, the first of their kind, passed in Oregon and Maine, and see that as sort of a precursor to what will probably be a trend across the country in more of these EPR bills. But the bottom line, particularly with the Maine and Oregon bills, is that you pay, as a producer, you pay a certain fee that can be to state or local waste management infrastructure, essentially, through something called a producer responsibility organization, and that entity helps collect the fees and get it to the necessary regulator or state body. And they can appear in a variety of different ways. Some of these EPR schemes are more top down from the regulator, from the state, saying you pay X amount of fee based on the recyclability of your your product based on certain attributes of the product, and others place the responsibility on the producers and the PROs to develop the fee structure and how they actually support and subsidize their waste management. So Maine and Oregon are fee-based that focus from the sort of top-down government-driven fee. But we see a bill in Maryland that's gaining momentum that is more producer-driven. It's more, places the emphasis on producers to say, how do you want to supply these fees? How do you want to pay for your end-of-life management of your plastic packaging? And that's getting a lot of industry support because of that flexibility and autonomy. California's got a ballot initiative that's a little bit more like Maine and Oregon, with a set amount of contribution to pay for the management of plastic packaging waste that we should keep an eye on because it's up for ballot initiative, up for vote in November 2022. So again, those are two states to watch, but it's also a good indication of the variety of types of bills and opportunities for advocacy for what might be good for your operations. This will certainly add cost to your work and to thinking about what kind of packaging you use. This will have an implication for your cost long term. So with that, I'd love to pass it back to Jen and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was super, super informative. Okay, so we'll see how many we can get through in 6 minutes. So, and also just so everyone knows, I'm going to be putting up the slides, the PDF in the text channel, so stay tuned.